Cameron Wing, college student. I'm what you would call a retro gamer. In this video, I'm going to cover the day and age of video games that I grew up with as a kid in the 1990s. We're going to cover the rivalries of the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Master System, as well as the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. And finally, we're going to cover the Nintendo 64 and the Sony PlayStation. And to help illustrate the facts about this topic, I've got the angry video game nerd to help me out here.
Kill me.
Okay, not really, but it's still gonna help in letting all this information soak in. There's no doubt that Sega and Nintendo were two of the biggest competitors in video game history. While these two Japanese companies duked it out, Nintendo eventually won over and came out on top over Sega. What exactly happened, you ask? Well, the main reason the NES triumphed was because of vital third-party resources, which Sega lacked. It had some third-party support, but not a whole lot. So yeah, almost all the games made for the Sega Master System were made by Sega. Another factor that could have been a nail in the coffin could have been the fact that there was a very huge difference of focus between the two companies. While Sega was focusing on advancing technology to get a unique experience for the players, Nintendo was just busily creating popular franchises for its system. Even when the Sega Master System was more technologically advanced than the Nintendo Entertainment System, it was bested in marketing and eventually bit the dust in the early 90s. Consoles, it was Sega and Nintendo duking it out yet again. Exhibit A, Sega Genesis. Released in Japan in 1988 and saw Western shores about a year later. Exhibit B, the Super Nintendo. In Japan in 1990 and brought to the United States in 1991. Both systems had a great amount of games and a lot of third-party support. In fact, there's actually a lot of heated competition between them still. I mean, the US marketers for Sega wanted to think of some way to take Nintendo out of the competition. So what did they do? They would create a slogan to badmouth Nintendo and glorify the Genesis.
What Nintendo? Bye.
Now, the Genesis was out a couple years before the Super Nintendo, so for a short while it was competing with the NES instead. So really, that slogan was pretty legit. I mean, that was the motivation behind that slogan. Now, when the Super Nintendo came out, the people at Sega had to come up with something else. So what did they do? Well, they created the idea of blast processing.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't.
Yeah, it was true to an extent. I mean, the Genesis was faster than the Super Nintendo. I mean, think about it. 7.6 megahertz versus 3.6 megahertz. I mean, the people at Sega exploited that, and therefore starting the whole rumor of blast processing. Though, over time, the Genesis eventually lost out to the Super Nintendo, even though it kept trying to keep up with it with add-ons like the Sega CD and the 32X. But even then, it just eventually bit the dust. But I will admit, though, that one Sega CD commercial really did make me laugh.
Hey, you! You don't own a Sega CD yet? What are you waiting for? Nintendo to make one? You've seen the games, right? Wrong answer, man. Show him.
With the new generation coming around, gamers were introduced to the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation. Both had great marketing, especially the PlayStation. You know, being the first CD-based major console. I mean, people really loved this advance in technology. Nintendo, on the other hand, had a pretty legit defense for the fact that they were still using cartridges for the 64. They argued that it would allow like shorter loading times for the games, as well as pretty much protection against piracy, because it's really hard to pull off if it's in a cartridge rather than a CD. Of course, there were bad signs to this sort of thing. I mean, with a cartridge, it takes like a lot more to make a cartridge instead of a CD. So because of that, licensing fees were up, and therefore causing third-party companies to be reluctant in making games for the 64. The upside to CDs rather than cartridges is that they allow more memory space, which was further proven with the release of Final Fantasy VII by Square Enix. But I digress. Both systems had a good line of games. I mean, the PS1 had like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro, and the 64 had like GoldenEye 007, Super Smash Brothers, and like I said, both games had really good titles.
I'm missing you so much, I'll say you die tonight, just so I can get to you, for the sun will rise. I know these times are hard, I feel this too. None of that ever seems to matter when I'm holding you. And I am wasting